Hello and welcome to Meet Your Neighbor, the show where we meet and talk with local artists and craftspeople. Today we have a special guest who is going to talk to us about the wonderful and fabulous world of antique clocks. Dr. Edward Tatro is here with us today. He is a clock aficionado, and we also have with us my co-host, Denise Wargowski. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
So Ed, tell us a little bit about first you. How long have you lived in the Lincoln Way area?
I was born in Joliet, lived there till I was 14, came out here in the early 60s. So I've been here since 1960, actually. No. Went to Lincoln Way High School after a year at Joliet, and went back to Joliet Junior College on to Northern Illinois University. Taught in Joliet for 3 years and came out here as a teacher in 1971, and then a counselor, a principal, and I retired as Associate Superintendent of Schools in the New Lenox Grade School System.
So you've been in the area for a long time, and I've seen all of the changes that have come.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about clocks. How did you get interested in clock collecting?
I came from pretty much of a mechanical family. My uncle was a mechanic. My father and grandfather and great-grandfather were all railroad engineers, and in those days when you ran a steam engine you had to know all the mechanics of the steam engine and how to make it work and whatever. So that was always around me, and I also was raised by parents out of the Depression and grandparents where you fix things rather than threw them out, and things were valued, and so you took care of it. And clocks, as a kid, I took a few alarm clocks apart, and usually the springs went boing, and I never did anything with it. I think I told you the story the other day. I worked at Braun Sales down here, which was like the forerunner of a Kmart or whatever, back in the 60s while I was going to junior college. And they had a clock they were throwing away in the jewelry section. It was a brand new one, but it wouldn't work. So I said, do you mind if I take it? I took it home and it fixed it, put it on my wall, and had it on the wall for a number of years. About 1970, 71, I was out of school working out here. I was engaged to be married, and my wife at that point had a clock in the family and had gotten out an antique gingerbread, also called a kitchen clock, because they were primarily put in the kitchen, but they were from the 1890s, 1900s. It had been her grandparents' wedding gift. Clocks were often valued and used as wedding gifts. They were a big thing.
Family heirloom.
And so this was a family heirloom. Anyhow, we got it back in the family. We went up to Rockford for a honeymoon, and there was a lot of antiques there. We came home with 2 more clocks. And I got a little clock, something like this, only kind of what's called a half of a humpback. This is a camelback clock, it's called. A lot of people would see those because most of our parents and grandparents had them on their TVs or something, as you know, we were growing up in the 60s and that. This clock I paid $12 for, and it cost me $15 to have it fixed. So I'm thinking, if I'm going to collect clocks, I probably ought to learn how to do something with them. So from there, do you want me to go on anymore, or you got other questions?
No, I think that that's fascinating. So I know you talked a little bit about repairing. So how did you learn to repair them? I mean, did you just pick it up and go sproing and then wait to see if you could put it back together?
Kind of in the hunt for clocks. You go into a lot of antique shops, you talk to a lot of people, and there were 2 guys in Joliet, a guy by the name of Tom Weiss that ran a antique store right down here on Washington Street, right off of Route 30 and down a little bit farther toward Joliet, and another guy named Roger Campbell, and he was a chemical worker or whatever. He worked in a chemical place, so he invented a clock cleaning solution. So anyhow, I brought some solution from him, and then he told me about how he worked on clocks. So he invited me to come up, and I started helping him a couple days a week, 1 day a week usually as was, and did that for a couple of years, and I just kind of picked it up. Also, I was recommended for the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. I think we've got a poster up here. This association has been around since the 30s. And they've got a great museum in Columbia, Pennsylvania, right out near Philadelphia. And their whole thing is to promote clock and watch collecting. The official thing of being a clockmaker or whatever, or a watch person, is a horologist. And I don't have any of those kind of degrees or any of that stuff, but I learned how to work on it. The organization sends out bulletins that talk about repairing clocks and working on clocks and watches. And so there's a lot of information to pick up here. They have a lending library for books. Books were a big part of it. One of the first things the guy did that helped me to learn how to work on them was to buy this book and read it and find out about practical clock repairing. And this one is still in print. It's been around since the 50s as well. And then we also get what was called a mart. So before the internet, there used to be a lot of advertising in here of clock people who would like to, sell their clocks or whatever. And so there's a lot of really fantastic. These are auction houses in New York where they're big, expensive kind of clocks. I don't have anything like that. So I just like dealing with them, I guess, and putting them together. And I like basket cases where they come in pieces and whatever.
Now, what is that? Explain what basket cases mean.
Please.
It's like, well, in the old car collecting, it's like getting a junker and then getting the parts and putting it all back together.
Okay.
So, for example, this.
So not a clock that maybe needs a little help at a special facility in a white jacket.
Special facility. I'm not getting that. What does that mean?
Basket case.
Basket case. Okay. Oh, all right. Gotcha. This clock here, for example, it's a school clock. It came. The case was just in pieces. I had movements that you pick them up places. A friend that lived in New Lenox and actually was on the New Lenox school board for a while, Jim McLaughlin, worked for the city of Chicago school system, and he was an engineer and a custodian, that kind of thing. And there were boxes, or not boxes, but piles of old clocks. They'd take them off the wall when they no longer needed them and threw them in the basement for storage. So he was able to get a few movements, and I purchased some movements from him, was able to match it up.
Now I'm going to pause you again. Yeah. Movement.
Okay. Good.
What exactly is a movement?
This is the mechanism. It's the engine that drives the clock. Okay. So that's the movement. It's very, very simple in terms of what it looks like. So you see some of these big, beautiful clocks. Some of them have much larger movements. Like if you have more add-ons, if you have a strike for the hour, if you have quarter-hour gongs, and those kind of things, they all have to be added to a movement. But that's a pretty simple timepiece movement, and timepiece means it only does time. A clock actually refers to a bell. It's a Latin word for bell, which means the clock. And the early clocks were your tower clocks, and they rang a bell so people could, because before the Industrial Revolution, there was no need for time as we know it, specifically. It was
rose with the sun and went to sleep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Very interesting.
I don't know if I didn't cover anything else here.
With the movements, do you buy that as a whole and then build the clock around it? How does that work? Or do you actually put the movements together yourself? Okay,
because I do antique clocks. Now you can make movements. There's a really neat article in this thing about making an early wooden clock. In the United States, the first clocks were made of wood. All the gears, all the plates. And they didn't have springs here because they couldn't make spring steel. So they ran big iron weights on ropes. Kind of thing would run those, like your early, what we call a grandfather clock or grandmother clock, tall case clocks. These all run with weights, and those early weights were just iron, and you didn't have a front. See, these don't have fronts that show the weights. Now this one does, but so they didn't have to be pretty. And then after our independence, early 1800s, we were able to begin to roll brass here and make brass, and also make spring steel, and so then they converted to that. Before that, and I'm probably getting off your question, before that we imported a lot from England and a little bit from Germany. Germany was the wooden clock kind of, center of the world, the Black Forest, Switzerland, southern Germany, that kind of thing, Austria. So I don't know if I answered that question. I probably got off.
So mostly you buy the movement in one piece?
I usually buy the clock in one piece. Okay. And then you have to work on the movement to make it work, sometimes refinish the case. My first love was, I told you that yesterday, was woodworking. And that's how I got interested in it. So when I learned from this guy, he gave me a movement very similar to that to work on, to take apart, put together. And so we did that for a while. While I was helping him with his other, he'd help me out with a piece here or there or whatever. And so when I finished with that, I made a case to go in for that movement to fit into. And that case was designed after a case that was made by a clock company.
And is that the case
this
over
is the case
here?
Right here. I did this on a kitchen table in a one-bedroom apartment when I was first married.
Hopefully when you varnished it, you opened the windows.
Yeah, and probably took it outside.
Yeah.
I don't remember where we varnished it, but there were pieces I had to go and saw in different spots, and I had a piece milled for it that I got to be friends with a carpenter or a guy that worked at a lumber yard that was able to do that. But so I like the woodworking part of it, but then I told you it costs to have that worked on. And so I learned to work on that as well. So usually when I buy something, it needs some work. Therefore, you get it a lot less expensive, and you got to make something out of it.
You have the joy of getting to do
Yes,
something with it,
right.
not just hanging it on a
Right.
wall.
And I have friends that collect them only. My one friend says that if it has issues, he doesn't want it. Issues meaning, there's a bad nick in it, or it's not working, or the dial's peeling, or something like that. He buys them for their art. And so it's a piece of art to him. So he gets the, the really nice clocks, and he's got a nice collection. Once in a while, I buy one of his that he's going to, let go because he's found something better. So.
Now, I notice on the clock over here, on the glass, it says regulator.
Okay.
Is that the manufacturer? What does that mean?
The clock industry is a lot like anything that happened in the Industrial Revolution, and you can look at the car industry today or a lot of makers of different things. When a guy that was interested in working on clocks apprenticed for a clockmaker and a watchmaker, sometimes they were the same because it's identical, only smaller in a lot of ways. When they completed it, their final exam, so to speak, was they had to build a clock that had to be very, very precise.
Wow.
And
kind of like their thesis.
It was their final paper, their final, the final thing that they had to do. When they then went out on their own, they took that clock with them and they used that to regulate anything they were working on to make sure it was keeping time correctly. And so the word regulator, in fact, today you'll still see jeweler's regulators. Some of these are called jeweler's regulators because they are so precise and so well constructed that they can be used for that. But the industry picked up on it when they started mass producing clocks, and people knew about jewelers regulators being a big deal.
Right.
So they started putting the word regulator on all their clocks. So you thought you got, you're getting a
Similar to the way organic is now on everything
There you-
food
maybe
related,
too,
even
yeah.
though there isn't an official standard for
Right.
that.
Right. So you'll see regulator, a lot of them, and usually the rectangular ones that would be perfectly rectangular were called store regulators or advertising regulators, because most stores, grocery stores especially, would have them on, and there'd be a advertisement in the bottom glass, like you see beer advertisements and things like that now. These were advertising baking soda and flour and things like that people would buy in the store in those days. So. And then the school clocks were often called school regulators, the octagon shape, or office regulators. An interesting thing about the clock is if you look at the dial, if you see 2 holes on the dial, or 3, you'll know that it not only does time, but it strikes on the hour, and sometimes half hour. And if there's a 3rd one, it'll have a chime every 15 minutes, and some of those change. Like your big grandmother clocks and grandfather clocks do that. But those are all, there was no such thing as that until that song, Your Grandfather's Clock, and the poem, hung so many years on the wall. Then they became grandfather clocks. Before that, they were always called tall case clocks.
Oh, okay.
And they had to be tall because the arc of the pendulum, if it's 39 inches, which is just a meter actually, keeps a second beat. So it'll beat every second as it goes.
So otherwise it wouldn't have enough space to swing to get the correct time.
Or it wouldn't be a second beat. And the second beat, the longer it is, the more accurate you can make it.
Okay.
Kind of the shorter it is, and of course they got a lot better, but the shorter the pendulum, it's harder to keep them adjusted, well. And they're influenced by temperature, they're influenced by moisture, they're influenced by a number of things. So that's why, electronics just keep making things better. And as I told you in the pre-meeting here, clocks were the technology of the day, and the best example of that is the International Time Recording Company, which made the clocks that you punched in for years and years, and a lot of places still punch in when you come to work. The International Time Recording became the International Business Machines Company, IBM. So they're the big computer giant was, so the technology of that day.
So IBM has been setting technology for quite some time.
Into, computers from clocks when it began. So
if someone wants to find out more information or is interested in repairing or starting to collect or even just learn about more about antique clocks, what would you say to someone who's interested in this and wants to learn more?
Well, being in a library and being on the library board, books, I mean, there's lots of books out there on antiques, on antique clocks, on clock repair, on even some old out-of-print books are available. They can be found in old bookstores, or sometimes, like I said, I got this one at the museum. Joining the organization, if you really have an interest and want to know, there's a Chicagoland chapter that meets every other month in Elmhurst, and they'll have a little mart where they'll trade and sell, and they'll have a little program, and it's the organization is basically an educational organization, and that's why they're a nonprofit as well.
So they're not in it to sell clocks and make money. They're in it to
Right.
encourage people to learn more about antique clocks and how they work
Exactly.
and wristwatches.
Exactly. In fact, our meetings have to be geared to that, as opposed to, even though we do have a mart where we sell and trade and things like that, it's the educational thing that you do. And there's a regional meeting each year. Sometimes people say, well, where do you come up with the clocks? And a lot of them through this, a lot of them through a meeting, occasionally in an antique store, but a lot of those have been, you know, many of the better clocks are in people's collections somewhere, so you don't find
They've
them.
already been scooped up. You're not going to find one in Grandma's attic, probably.
Well, some people still do. Depends on how old the house is. Yeah, not the modern houses, probably the 60s or whatever, but there's a lot of houses that were built around 1900, and there are clocks in the attics. Every once in a while, somebody will, even on the internet. The other thing is the internet's a good source for learning about them. If you have a particular kind of clock you'd like, you can learn, you know, again, it's the internet. It's not always totally believable, but for most things, there's, you know, you can compare and contrast.
Maybe go to the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, and I'm sure they have a lot of resources on their website.
They have a website
that will lead you to accurate information instead of maybe going on Wikipedia where it might not be 100%.
Yeah, and that's typical with anything, right, on the internet.
Yes.
But there's a lot of good information there too,
Yes.
so I don't want to, but you know, you believe it, you compare and contrast and decide, you know, is it true or isn't it true?
Analyze.
So one of the things I enjoy about it is getting together with people who think like that, and so going to the meetings, just talking, you know, kind of rubbing elbows with, and hey, I got this problem, how did you deal with that, you know? And I just do it as a hobby. I'm a hobbyist. There are a number of people that do it for a business, and I often get asked, do you repair clocks? And I really don't, because I don't want to get into the hassle of that. I mean,
you have enough to do
family and
repairing your
friends,
clocks.
Because keeping them running, that's one of your questions. Isn't it your turn to ask that question? Is something about what goes wrong with clocks, or what's
what's something that can go wrong with the clocks that you'd have to...
The biggest thing, and most people don't think about this, is, and it's, again, the generation now that we just throw things away when they stop working.
Right.
But the biggest thing is people will run them till they stop. And I always give the analogy, you would not run your automobile without changing the oil and lubricating, you know, the proper joints and all that kind of stuff until it stopped. Because then it would be broken. It would be no good.
Exactly.
And that's the same thing with a clock. It needs to be cleaned and oiled on occasion, and usually that's, you know, like a 5-year period if you're running it all the time. What happens is dirt gets into the pivot holes, which is where the shafts come through, and those wear oblong, which will make your gears bind, and when they bind, they stop. If you wait that long, you got to have a complete overhaul. You have to have new pivots put in, the whole bit. If you clean it and oil it once in a while, it's kind of like, again, like the oil change. It's been
proper maintenance.
Right. $25 on oil change, it saves your engine from having to be overhauled, you know, at 100,000 miles.
Well, Ed, this is absolutely fascinating, and I want to thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this. I know that there's so much more that we could cover, and so I know I, for one, am definitely going to be checking out the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, because my husband is a big wristwatch collector.
That's a big part of it.
More modern, only a few antiques, but this I think is absolutely fascinating. So thank you so very much for coming and sharing this wonderful information and some of the pieces from your collection with us today.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.